The only plan is to let it collapse and then turn to the government the way they did in 2008 and 9 and the way they did in 2020 and declare a disaster and then hope the government comes in and bails them out. But the popular tolerance for that is less now, because now when people say, how many times are we going to bail out the banks? The answer has to be very different from what it was before.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to welcome back Professor Richard Wolff. As many of you already know, Professor is one of my favorite experts on economics. In addition to his academic career, Professor Wolff is an author and co-founder of the organization Democracy at Work and a popular YouTube channel where he shares frequent economic updates and interviews. Be sure to follow Professor Wolff's channel. I will link it in the description below to stay up to date on his latest work. Professor, welcome back. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
So the US economy appears to be on the brink of a major, let's just say, event. Domestically, the economy continues to weaken while the entire world outside of the Western bubble is effectively working on alternative financial systems, which will likely lead to the US currency eventually losing its reserve status. The process of de-dollarization has already begun, and we will focus on that shortly. Professor, first, I would love to get your perspective on the latest economic data. The US job growth continues to decline, and unemployment numbers actually are rising. The official data is revised down every single month. That's become a norm now. Employment gains have been part-time jobs, while the number of full-time jobs have been declining. And what's really important is that the unemployment rate is at the highest level since November of 2021. Yet on July the 9th, in his testimony to US Congress, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said, look, labor market appears to be on track. It's fully back in balance, Powell said. So, Professor, what is your read on the most recent economic data, and how do you interpret Powell's latest commentary?
Well, my first reaction is to remind Mr. Powell that balance is like beauty. It exists in the mind of the beholder. What it is each of us finds beautiful is not the same as what other people find beautiful, and the same is true of economic balance. Most Americans right now are worried about their jobs. They're worried about keeping them. They're worried about job conditions, even if they do keep them. They're worried about their salaries, and they're worried about the prices that they have to pay with whatever salary they get. So to say it's in balance, if you meant by that people are secure and comfortable in the situation they're in, then I have no idea what Mr. Powell is talking about. I do understand what he is doing. His job is to manage what I would call the contradictions of capitalism, the tendency of the system on one hand to produce inflation and on the other to produce recession. And the oscillation between inflation and recession, otherwise called the business cycle, is a problem that capitalism has had from its beginning and that it has never been able to solve. And the closest it's come is to create central banks and monetary authorities and to give them the job of minimizing whatever inflation happens and minimizing whatever recession happens. But that's all they do. They can't obliterate them. They can't overcome them. They can't make them go away, which is what everybody wishes. The working class wishes it. The employer class wishes it. Nobody wants the cycles to keep happening. And yet, let's just take a look. This is a new century. We're 24 years into the 21st century. We've had an economic downturn in this US capitalism in the spring of the year 2000, again in the autumn of the year 2008, again in the year 2020, and we are now facing a decline that looks like it's the beginning of the next downturn. Every 4 to 7 years, we have a crash or a downturn or a recession. We have lots of words because we have this experience over and over again. Now, I would say an economy that has had this problem, that knows it has this problem, where everybody agrees it would be better if we didn't have this problem, and yet can't solve it. The fact of the matter is that the Federal Reserve, the agency that Mr. Powell heads, permitted this inflation to happen. They're not supposed to have that happen. And before that, they permitted the recession of 2020, which is one of the worst recessions the United States has ever had. So their ability to prevent this is zero. They can't. And so now they're scrambling before the next one hits. That's not a recipe to say the economy is in great shape. No, it isn't. But now let's get to the deeper question. Why isn't it? Well, for the last 40 years, at least since the early 1980s, the inequality of income and wealth in the United States has grown steadily worse. Whether you measure it by the Gini coefficient, which is what economists use, or any one of a dozen other ways of looking at the statistics, everybody, and I mean nearly everybody, sees the growing gap between rich and poor. Okay, so that means you're sitting now in the year 2024 on a U.S. capitalism that has had 40 years of unstable business cycle oscillation, and on top of it, growing inequality. And as if that weren't enough, for the first time in a century, the United States has a major global economic competitor, namely the People's Republic of China. And the G7, that's the United States and its allies, is now a smaller economic unit by output, by wealth, than China and the BRICS, which is the other unit power in the world. I mean, that's a completely new situation. Every country on earth, including the United States, is adjusting to this new situation. That's why the dollar is going down, as you referenced a few moments ago. That's why many of the other things we see and experience are happening, because of this confluence of an unstable, unequal, seriously competitive environmental set of conditions for the United States. I'm not saying that we are about to collapse. I'm not saying that there's no way out. I'm not doing that. But I am saying let's look soberly and honestly at what the problems are, the big ones. And let's not get caught up in all the little ups and downs. I mean, you referenced one yourself. If you look at the latest numbers, well, goodness, the employment isn't so bad. But then when you notice that they've had to revise last month and the month before, and those revisions saw the disappearance of what we thought were hundreds of thousands of jobs, well, then you begin to understand the larger picture is not the rose-colored image you're likely to encounter in most media today.
And in addition to that, many people are really worried about the banking sector here in the United States. What I thought was quite interesting is that in the same testimony to Congress on July the 9th, Jerome Powell briefly alluded to the risks associated with the banking sector. He said commercial property risks will last years. So he's saying this is not going away. This is going to last years. We know that small to mid-sized banks have the highest exposure to commercial real estate loans. So since Powell says this is likely to last years, do you feel that we may see turmoil and bank collapses in the near future?
I'm afraid I do. And let me expand a little bit on what Powell said. There's another statistic that came out today, a statistic that measures the percentage of office space in the United States that is empty, vacant, that is not being rented by any kind of business venture. Okay? And the interesting thing about that is it is at over 20%, which is very, very high by historical standards. But even more important, it is all of the problems of the pandemic, which we thought might be behind us now that the worst of the pandemic is a year or two behind us, has not worked out. The latest few years since the end of the pandemic, or the last 2 or 3 years, the empty office space is getting worse, not better. And here's the reason. Most office space, not all, but most of it, is in the hands of renters who have multi-year leases. Typical leases in commercial sector are between 5 and 10 years. This is very important because it means that the landlord can go into court even if a business is failing, even if a business has collapsed, and try to get the rental that the lease requires the renter to pay. The crisis for the landlord is only when the lease is over, because then you can't go after your renter. You have to find a new renter, and that's exactly what there is not any of. And so now you go to your bank and you say to your bank as a landlord, my renters are at the end of their lease. I'm not getting any rent. I can't get any rent. Even if they're going bankrupt, I have no claim on any assets anymore. So I can't pay the loan that you, the bank, gave me to become the landlord of this property. That's what's unfolding now. That's why Mr. Powell is talking about years. Most of the leases in place at the time of the pandemic have not yet ended. And so we are waiting for those renters to be telling their landlords, I'm not giving you another nickel because the lease is over and my business is impossible. So if you want me to stay, you're going to have to give me a rental half of what you charged me before, or else I'm leaving because there's lots of empty space where people are desperate. This situation we are not even halfway through. And therefore, the banks that are already making arrangements to wait are discovering that the wait isn't going to pay the bills. Even if they wait a year and allow a landlord not to be forced out because they can't pay the rent, the idea that in 6 months or 12 months, I will have that rental back, that is now disappearing. And the great anxiety of all medium and small banks around the country, and quite a few big ones, is when does this situation, which is already bad and which is already getting worse, when will it get to the point where we are seeing banks collapse, where we are seeing banks unable to meet their obligations because the landlords to whom they've lent so much money cannot meet theirs? And the interesting thing to point out is that at this point, everybody's waiting. Nothing is happening. There's no national plan for this situation. There's no bank sector plan for how to deal with it. Or maybe, let me put it this way. The only plan is to let it collapse and then turn to the government the way they did in 2008 and 9 and the way they did in 2020 and declare a disaster and then hope the government comes in and bails them out. But the popular tolerance for that is less now, because now when people say, how many times are we going to bail out the banks? The answer has to be very different from what it was before. So bottom line, Mr. Powell is right. It's not just that it's going to last for years. That's for sure. But how bad it will get, how disruptive it will be, nobody knows. And I am not aware of anything like a plan for how to deal with this. Last point. If we are, as Mr. Powell hinted, going into a recession now, as unemployment rises, as job numbers go down, as we see the usual signs, well, then you have to see a downturn on top of this office vacancy problem. That adds yet another burden on a system that does not look like it's in anything like the shape needed to absorb that.
Do you feel that we may see bank consolidations as the result of banks effectively losing liquidity? Those banks that are exposed to commercial real estate that is now dropping in value and vacancies going up?
Yes, there's no question. I believe that's a consensus point of view, left wing, right wing, center, it doesn't really matter. Everybody realizes that the bank consolidation we saw with the Silicon Valley Bank a couple years ago, with the First Republic Bank in New York and California, those were very large banks. They had been thought to be very secure. First Republic is a bank that deals really only with wealthy people and very stable corporate entities. Silicon Valley Bank, which is in the middle of the most profitable sector of the U.S. economy, for those two banks to have been wiped out by interest rate movements, which is basically what they weren't prepared for, suggests to you that a much broader phenomena encompassing many more parts of the country and many more banks, like the commercial loan industry, that is going to have very serious disruptive impact. And my guess is that the solution found for Silicon Valley Bank and for First Republic Bank will be found even quicker and easier for the many small and medium banks who are already consolidating, because many of them can see it coming. And if you see that wave coming, it's a little bit like a tsunami. You'll get a better deal if you make your merger now than if you make it after half of your deposits are gone.
I know many of our viewers are probably thinking, what is the timeline? So I know we don't have a crystal ball, and I know there's so many different things at play here, especially with the elections coming up here, hopefully in a couple of months. So if someone asked you, what kind of timeline are we looking at? Of course, it depends on a variety of factors, and some of them are likely not even known to us at this point in time. But what would you answer to that question?
Well, I'm afraid the answer I give is probably not going to please your audience. I wish I could give you a clear notion, do this, don't do that. The problem is that there are several unknowns here that are so enormous in their implications that you hesitate to make any statement until these unknowns are better known. Now, you've mentioned one, obviously, the election. But the election this time has potential for economic disruption far beyond what you would normally expect and what we have normally had. Let me give you simply one example. The Republican Party that has fielded Mr. Trump, who will be their candidate in November, I'd be assuming everything is more or less the way it is now. The Republican Party has just publicly issued its platform, the official commitments it has made to its voters, saying, if you vote for us, this is what we will do if we become the regime after November. Okay, the Republican calls for the following: an across-the-board 10% tariff against everyone in the world on everything, and a 30% tariff on top of that against China. Okay, that changes everything. That changes every supply chain. That requires every government in 190 countries to rethink where their future is, where they're going to buy, where they're going to sell, where they're going to invest. Everything changes, and these changes take time. Do you really mean that? Are you really going to do that? Are we going to try to rebuild in the United States the manufacturing that will be blocked by these tariffs from coming in? Well, American wages are much higher. If you manufacture here with American wages, and particularly when you are reducing your population because of your anti-immigrant position, which the Republicans have even stronger than the Democrats, you're going to have an inflation here. The inflation is going to go up, not down, because of that effect alone, even before you look at other potential variables. The American working class accepts mediocre wages because it can go to TJ Maxx or to Target or to Walmart and get unbelievably cheap appliances and clothing. Why? Because we bring that in mostly from Asia, some other places, at low prices. If tariff 10%, all the prices will now go up. I mean, what are you doing? The economic dislocations will change the calculations of every business in every country, some more, some less. But for me to predict what's going to happen, I couldn't possibly. And I don't know what the Democratic Party is going to do. More recently, the Democratic Party does what the Republican Party does, only not quite so much and a little later. But if that's the response here, then we are leaving the world of neoliberal globalization, 1980, 2020, and we are moving into the world of competing economic nationalism. That's that is as big a change as any we have seen in our lifetimes. That will have the impact on the global economy of something like World War I or World War II. So, and who could predict what came out of that? You know, going into World War I, the world was divided in the British Empire, the French Empire. At the end of World War II, the empire's all gone or in the process of disappearing. I mean, you literally had to buy a new map because your old map was completely out of date. So it is a particularly uncertain time that I have to say in response to a question like that. And then there are finally all of the issues, and they are many, that are raised particularly by the People's Republic of China. They have shown us that they can grow economically faster than anybody in the world. That is the reality for 30 plus years now. Every year, the GDP in China grows 2 to 3 times faster than that in the United States. That's why they have caught up. That's why they have a high-tech sector that literally competes with Silicon Valley here in the United States. We have Google and we have Apple, but they have the equivalent. And in a number of areas, they are moving ahead of the United States. They make better, cheaper electric vehicles than we do. They make better, cheaper solar panels than we do. I could go on, but you know, this is changing the whole world. The rest of the world that competes with the United States can buy cheap, high-quality inputs from China. We can't because our tariff and our politics keep China goods now harder and harder to get. But that's very bad for the competitive future of American industries. They can't buy inexpensive quality inputs the way our competitors in Europe and elsewhere in the world can. Nobody has sat down that I'm aware of, and I follow literature. No one has sat down and said, well, wait a minute here. Instead, we have this ideological debate, which is better for America, tariffs or free trade? I don't know the answer to that. And I know nobody else does. And in that situation, you better make a decision, because if you don't, if you make your decision hang on which ideological group is stronger, you may be making mistakes on a scale that are catastrophic. And let me end this point with giving you an example that everybody will understand, I think. When Russia invades Ukraine in February of 2022, the United States and Western Europe, its allies, come to a plan. They're going to fund Ukraine, they're going to arm Ukraine, and they're going to impose sanctions on Russia above all. And those sanctions are mostly about not buying Russian oil and gas. This was a colossal mistake, because they didn't understand that Russia now has an alliance with the BRICS, with India, with China, and that they can turn to India and China, ask them to buy the oil and gas, which it did, and they bought it, and therefore Russia did not lose its oil and gas market. It didn't sell them in Europe anymore, but it found Asian buyers. If you had understood what's going on, you would have understood that that was a possibility and that that would make your sanctions fail. They didn't. So they applied the sanctions and they failed. That's why you don't hear much about them anymore. The oil cap plan of Janet Yellen, a complete bust. Russian ruble is stronger than it was before. The Russian economy is more productive than it was before. Americans didn't understand it, even though in the World War II, the depressed American economy of the 1930s was given a great boost by that war, just as Russia got a boost out of its Ukraine war. That this was unthinkable tells you that there are blinders going on. And I think that if I had to pinpoint the biggest problem, the changing world economy, the decline of the G7, the rise of the BRICS, that changes everything. And if you don't take that into account, if you don't give that the weight it deserves among all the factors you're looking at, you are going to make unbelievably serious mistakes, whether you are a business person or an investor or a saver or someone looking for a job. All of those things are now in play.